Hello my dear friends and welcome to my channel. Don't forget to make yourself a cup of tea with snacks if you want, because today we have very interesting stories, and one of them is a story about a woman with a man who thought OP tried to poison their daughter and called the police. Please subscribe if you haven't and I hope you'll enjoy it. My stepmother isn't the greatest person. She's verbally abusive and has been married to my father for the past 14 years. She's caused me to deal with a lot of anxiety and I have a little PTSD from this history that her and I share. She's done a lot of crappy things, but my father hasn't divorced her due to my mother ruining his mindset when she abandoned us 17 years ago, and there's a lot of money and inheritance that would be involved in the event of a divorce. Now that the history has been shared, here's the actual story. Back when I was about 8, my grandmother bought me a diary. I had been obsessed with the littlest pet shop toys, so it was themed around them with a pink fuzzy exterior with a monkey stitched into it. When my stepmother got upset with me, or she thought I was hiding something, she'd absolutely tear my room apart. She'd find things and try to read whatever she got her hands on, or she'd find new things to take when I got grounded for the stupidest of things. What I can only assume is she found my diary one of these times, because the events that unfolded next is the only logical reason I can come up with for why she found out what was written in it. At the time, I kept my diary underneath my bed in the rungs that held up my mattress. I came back from my mom's for the weekend, my life there was not much better than home, and my room was in an unusual distressed state. There were things on the floor and pulled out of drawers, but I checked under my bed and found my diary was still where it belonged, though not exactly where I left it. Luckily, I kept the keys to the lock under my bedside table, somewhere where she probably wouldn't think to look. A few weeks later, my stepsister came to visit. She's 11 years my elder, and at the time this event happened I was 10 and didn't use the diary that often. There were actually never many entries that I put into it as it was rather sporadic when I wanted to write into it. Well, my stepsister was in town. She asked me if I had a diary and I told her I did. She asked me if she could read it, and though I didn't know her well because she was never around and lived across the country at the time, I agreed because I trusted her to some degree. The next day my stepmother confronted me about one of the entries and I knew that she had gotten her hands on it as well because of what she fussed at me about. One day I had taken my diary over to my grandmother's with me not long after I got it because I was writing in it all the time at 8 years old. My grandmother lived across the street and one day my stepbrother was over there as well, and he was quite a nuisance because he's as entitled as my stepmother even at the age of 6. He was pretty bratty and it was irritating. I had written in my diary that I wanted him to go home. Now, to note, I dated my diary entries. When I wrote this entry, it had been 2 years beforehand. So, when my stepmother confronted me, it was kinda stupid at this point. She tore into me too, saying, "What do you mean you want him to go home? This is his home. Do you not want him to be here? Do you hate us this much? You should be ashamed." Summarized from what I remember because it's been forever. She wouldn't let me tell her where I had written the entry the 2 years beforehand, and she just kept running me over and over and over, and I just kind of shut down. She shook the diary in my face the whole time, and I just stared at it upset because I couldn't get a word in, and she was blaming me for not carrying around either of them. I ended up grounded for what I wrote. I used the diary to let out my feelings, though many of them were angry childish rants about people who were mean to me at school. I never mentioned her or my stepbrother despite what she did to me besides that one entry. When she gave me the diary back, I put it under my bedside table and never wrote anything else in it. I was too scared that she'd find it and get upset with me again. It stayed there under that spot until I moved my stuff out of the house 2 years ago. I can't remember if it's still in a box or if I threw it in the trash, more than likely the latter. I never kept a private diary again. Instead, I ended up writing about my life through blogging sites around the age of 13, and boy was I able to talk about her then to my heart's content. God, that makes me so angry. I'm so sorry that you have such a person for a stepmom. Behaving like that to a child in your care is the worst kind of evil. First off, I really like small women. Part of it is my mom and a number of the women in my family are short, and if I can find a woman who can even slightly compare to my mom, I will be the luckiest man on earth and live up to the Lelo and Stich line. Tiny, but fierce. Time. Spring break. Place. Fort Lauderdale. Past, me, a lovable but pure idiot, EPD, entitled parent's daughter, ED, entitled dad, EM, entitled mom, FCF, friend cop female, FCP, friend cop's partner, male. The story: about 10 or 15 years ago I was in college in Fort Lauderdale, made spring break fun easy to have, so I decided to go down to the beach to do some photography homework. I ended up finishing near a bar a friend of mine worked at who told me about a nice scotch they had at the bar. It was a 20-year-old, single malt, estate bottling. Very rare for bar service, so I got a glass, went across the street to sit on the wave wall, drink my scotch, read my book, and ogle all the ladies on the beach. Sue me, I was 24 at the time, thusly an idiot. After about an hour or so I was finishing my scotch, you don't rush good scotch, and thinking of heading out, a very lovely young lady approached and sat down beside me. Now to let you all understand, let me describe her. She was about 5'3", long red hair, petite, large A cup or small B, well proportioned, and a very definite womanly figure. She was wearing a bikini one-piece, started at a point between the legs spreading to about 1/5, about 1/3 of the way to her waistline before splitting into 2 3/4 strips that went up over her nipples before ending in a point and string tying behind the neck. Along the back the string went between her butt cheeks before splitting into 2 strings that came around and tied into the V just below the breasts, with a cross string tying the 2 arms of the V together. Not an outfit for a child. We got talking and I decided to hang out a bit longer to see how thing would go. After a bit I offered to grab us some drinks, but when she asked for a daiquiri I figured to cover my butt and asked if she had some ID, as she was young looking enough to get me in trouble if I didn't check. So she pulled out an ID saying she had turned 21 last month, legal yay, and handed it over to show the bartender. I came back about 15 min later with our drinks. The bartender had no problem with the ID, and we continued chatting. But, as things kept going and she continued to drink her drink, something started to come off as wrong. I started to think she was underage, but as the ID passed muster with the bartender, I wasn't too worried as the fake ID was on her if something came up. Enter EP. As we were finishing our drinks, and I was working up the nerve to invite her to my room, up walks a couple, couldn't be more stereotypical tourists if they had actually used that white crap on their noses, and approaches the girl. "Hey honey, where did you go? We've been looking everywhere for you. What's that you're drinking?" "I don't know, some sort of strawberry slushy type drink." He, pointing at me, got me. "This is alcoholic. You gave my daughter an alcoholic drink, how dare you? I'm calling the cops." "You jerk. You probably medicined it, didn't you? You'll go directly to jail giving a 15-year-old a medicine drink." Obviously on hearing that the pucker factor went to 11, I mean I knew I did nothing wrong, but still, 15. I tried to explain about the fake ID and was about to get on them about her bikini when I was cut off with, "Our daughter would never do something like that." Turns to EPD. "Would you, honey?" EPD shakes her head no. At this point I figure discretion is the better part of valor and sit back down, hoping the bartender would remember the ID I showed him. I proceeded to sit and ignore the haranguing they were spewing and wait for the cops. I also noticed what looked like her ID dropped in the sand behind the wall. This is important later. A few min later the cops arrived in the person of FCF, who was a D&D friend with me and the bartender, and her partner FCP. ED and EM, dragging EPD, immediately rush up to FCF spinning their tale of how I tried to medicine EPD with an alcoholic drink, and when they mention my fake ID excuse, EPD actually opens her purse and offers to let them search it. After this FCF pulls the aside to get their statement, and FCP approaches me with a very conflicted look. We had met a couple of times before and got along good, but this was pretty serious of a situation. Before he even said something, I asked him to lean over the wall and pointed to the fake ID. After he retrieved the ID and examined it, I explained my side of the story. After my explanation he took a closer look at EPD's swimsuit, and his eyes nearly popped out of his head at how skimpy it was. If it had more than 5 square inches of fabric, including the strings, I would be shocked. FCP pulled FCF aside, where they had a brief discussion, before they arrested all 3 of them, EPD for a fake ID, and EM and ED for child endangerment, I think. We all heard later at the next D&D game that although they never went to jail, they were held for the entire 48 hours, had their vacation ruined and ended up with some major fines, and a call to their state's DCFS. Ever since then my spidey sense goes off. I'm out of there. Hope you all enjoyed my EP experience. Interesting story, I like it. I do not understand what the parents of this girl hoped for. Or did they just decide to charge you for fun? Either way, their plan failed. Now, my stepmother and I have a long-running history going on 14 years now. She came into my life when I was very young, and she's been tormenting it since. I have tons and tons of stories about her, but this one will give a brief history of her antics. The backstory is a chunk of it, but very important to the event in the title. My stepmother is not liked by my father's side of the family for many reasons. 1. She didn't treat my sister, father, or I very well, and 2. She drove my father into debt with her high shopping sprees. My stepmother also has 2 children, a daughter who is a little over 11 years older than me, I'm 20, and a son who is 3 years younger than me. My grandmother lived across the street from where my sister and I grew up. She helped my dad out a lot after my mom left, and she watched over the 2 of us like hawks. I think she had an intuition about my stepmother because she didn't like her very much from the start. It came to a boil one day about a month before her and my dad got married. My grandfather had just passed away, and one of my older cousins was outside doing yard work for my grandmother. My grandfather had a little playground put in for my sister and I, but we had gone to see our mother for the weekend, so my stepmother took my stepbrother over there. It was all nice and dandy until my stepbrother started taunting my cousin, saying, "Your grandpa died. Your grandpa died." We had just been to the funeral the week beforehand, so the wound was still pretty open for all of us. My cousin told my stepmother to tell him to stop, but she just kind of stuck up her nose and said that he was fine and he was just being a kid. Side note, my stepbrother is now 18 and super entitled. My cousin was very upset, so he went up to the house and told my grandmother. My grandmother was a tough woman when it came to my stepmother and defending her grandchildren. She marched down to the playground and asked my stepmother to leave as she wasn't welcome on her property if she was going to allow her son to speak in the manner that he was. My stepmother retaliated and called my grandmother a witch. My grandmother swore back at her, and it led up to my stepmother following her up the driveway and my grandmother throwing a doormat at her. There was always tension around the holidays after that, and my grandmother's hate for my stepmother grew throughout the years as she learned about how we were being verbally abused. She suggested to my father many times that he needed to get a divorce for the sake of my sister and I, but he didn't. My grandmother became sick about 4 years after they got married. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and while she did go into remission, it did come back. My cousin was living with my grandmother when she was diagnosed, and they had a very close bond with one another. My cousin got engaged a little over a year and a half before my grandmother passed. They found out that her cancer had returned not long before his wedding, and she was super sickly, so we knew that this may have been the last big family event we were all going to have together, and it was sadly. My cousin and his wife chose my sister and I for flower girls, so we were a part of the wedding, and due to that, we didn't arrive with our parents. We didn't see much of them at all before the wedding because we had to get our hair done along with the rest of the party. At the church, my sister and I were standing outside the chapel talking with my cousin when I saw him make a face. My stepmother, father, and stepbrother had just walked in the door, and my stepmother was wearing white. Now, my cousin's wife had been a part of the family for long enough to know about my stepmother's antics, and if it wasn't for the fact that she was getting ready for her wedding, she would have thrown my stepmother out then and there. My cousin didn't want to cause any trouble on the big day though, so he let it slide, but I know my dad caught the look that he gave him. The wedding goes fine, and before the reception, we were all taking photos. Everyone knew at this point of my stepmother's attire as she was standing at the doors of the chapel smirking during photos that she attempted to butt into, but wasn't considered a part of the immediate family or wedding party, and if the looks that everyone was giving her could kill, she'd have been dead. My grandmother had dressed her best that day despite her illness, and she hung onto my cousin's arm during their photo before I heard her mumble, "I'll be damned if she wears white to another wedding with that grin on her face." Again, my grandmother was tough. This is anticlimactic, but no fights broke out, no one yelled at anyone. The only thing that did happen is that my cousin had a long talk with my father about his wife, about how this was a family event, and she knew that what she wore was extremely frowned upon. She did try to butt into every conversation during the reception, and her son acted like a total jerk the whole time, but that was expected. Her actions though spoke loudly about her character, as we all knew that my grandmother wasn't doing well. My sister and I were still super young, so we knew that she wasn't going to be seeing her other two grandchildren get married. She knew that this was going to be one of the last few times the family got together in celebration of something, and my stepmother had to step all over it and draw attention to herself. My grandmother passed away that November, the wedding was in June. When my grandmother went into hospice, my stepmother booed and hooed like she actually cared, but she kept talking about her own mother's battle with cancer, trying to compare the two, as if they had some sort of resemblance, but the illness was the only thing comparable. My stepmother thought she had something left for her in the will, but she was definitely wrong about that. She didn't act up at the funeral, but she did during Christmas, which was the toughest holiday for all of the family, as we spent it at my grandmother's house, and it was the first time she wasn't there to be with us. My grandmother had picked out specific things relating to her for the 4 grandchildren and my cousins' wives when she went into hospice. My stepbrother didn't get anything from my grandmother that year, and my stepmother threw a fit, storming out of the house and going home, even though the gifts we were given were sentimental to the connection we had with our grandmother. It's been 8 years, and she still won't get over the fact that my grandmother didn't give him a gift that Christmas, or maybe it's because she didn't get anything in the will, though she had in the past. She still hangs it over our faces sometimes. Her own father is a very old man now, but ever since my grandmother's passing, she's told my sister and I. Your grandmother didn't give me, stepbrother, and stepsister anything when she died, so my dad won't give you and sister anything. It's only fair. I can't freaking stand her. My grandmother must be rolling around in her grave if she's seen half the crap my stepmother has done since then. Your father is an idiot for not kicking this toxic witch out of your lives long ago. He needs to grow a spine before he loses both his daughters. Sorry you've had to go through this, and sorry about your grandma, she sounded awesome. Well guys, that's it for today. If you end up enjoying this video, please consider subscribing, and if you missed the last episode on the channel, I'm gonna link it right here. The story is about a woman who tried to steal OP's friend's laptop and got what she deserved. Check this out if you haven't, and I'll see you in my next video.